Welcome to Whistle Where You Work. I'm Mark Cohen. In the face of the global financial meltdown, the World Bank recently announced plans to more than double loans to developing countries. The bank is owned by 185 member countries with greatly varying influence. Its mission is to provide financial and technical assistance to developing countries. The bank is still digging out from its own public relations meltdown, the scandal in 2007 that forced neocon icon Paul Wolfowitz to resign as bank president. So the news that hackers have regularly breached the bank's highly confidential computer system, and that the very company the bank hired to protect its IT system now openly admits to massive fraud, that isn't the PR facelift Bank President Robert Zoellick has sought. With us to discuss the state of the bank are Neil Watkins, National Coordinator of Jubilee USA, and Bea Edwards, International Director of the Government Accountability Project. Bea, let's start with you. The bank has been dogged for a number of years by various contentions about its lending policies. You've been looking at one in particular regarding an HIV program in India. Can you tell us about that?
Well, the bank has a series of very sizable loans to the government of India that are implemented by the Ministry of Health to address the problem of HIV/AIDS throughout the country. And we had a whistleblower come to us on the project who told us that the National AIDS Control Organization in India was buying and using blood testing equipment in the HIV/AIDS project that did not work, and that these test kits produced what they call false negatives, that the test kits would tell people who were in fact infected with HIV/AIDS that they were negative, that they were not infected, and that as a result of that, contaminated blood could be getting into the blood supply for transfusions in India and spreading HIV/AIDS rather than containing it.
And what was the bank's role in this?
Well, the bank was funding the program, and the bank had received other allegations of misconduct, of corruption and fraud over a period of years. And it did field an investigation of all the healthcare projects in India, and our whistleblower was in fact one of the investigators. When the bank received concrete evidence of what kind of corruption there was and the life and death effects of it, their reflex seemed to be to try to contain the PR problems rather than to directly address the public health issue.
And Neil, the current financial crisis, it's a global financial crisis, and the bank is responding to that by, as I indicated in the introduction, doubling the amount of loans that it plans to offer. Is the bank now on the right track? Is it doing what it should be doing?
Well, you're right that they've now said that they want to double the lending that they do. Just in this year, actually, the World Bank is planning to double their lending over the previous year, and World Bank President Zoellick has said that over the next 3 years, the World Bank plans to lend $100 billion to developing countries. Now, obviously, poor countries need access to finance. The credit crisis that's affecting us here in the United States is also affecting countries across the globe, and it's important that public sources are available. But the concerns that those in civil society have about the World Bank, there are two issues with this new role for the World Bank coming in and this huge increase coming in that we need to pay attention to. One is that in the past, well, first of all, this money should be provided in a way that is transparent and that is done in an accountable way. So we want to make sure that this isn't funding the sort of corruption that we've seen in other World Bank projects.
And where is this money coming from?
Well, the money will come from the World Bank's reserves. It will also come eventually from some of the World Bank's bondholders. The World Bank is actually financed largely by issuing bonds on the private financial market. And it may be coming back to governments like the United States and asking for contributions.
And so how does this compare to what the bank has done in the past, and why should we be hopeful that this will make a big difference?
Well, like I said, in the past, they've given about $13 billion a year from the IBRD, one of their branches. This year, they're going to move that up to $35 billion. I'm worried, in fact, that the bank has not learned some of the lessons of its past lending, and we need to see greater controls on transparency and accountability. We also need to have the bank step away from the sort of deregulatory model that it has promoted in its development approach. So we're seeing in the United States this sort of deregulation on Wall Street model is failing spectacularly. The question is, the World Bank has long promoted this similar model around the world, and will they continue to promote that, or will they also learn the lessons in their lending going forward?
And what are those lessons that they should learn, and how would it change what the bank does with its money?
Well, I think that it's clear that with public money that is coming from a global public institution like the World Bank, you need to make sure there is accountability for those funds. But you also have to do it in a way that respects the country's economic development approach. So in the past, the World Bank has told countries, in order to get loans from us, you must privatize this industry. You need to increase your water rates for consumers and sell your water company to a private company. This has, in many cases, opened the door to corruption, and it has also increased the cost of basic services to poor people. So one of the lessons that the bank, I think, needs to learn is that this deregulatory, this privatized model needs to be rethought in light of this current crisis.
Bea, there was a very serious breach of the bank's computer security system recently. What's at stake there?
Well, the bank, because of the role that it plays in the international economy, which Neil described, has in its Treasury unit a series of categories of financial information that is very confidential to all of the member governments of the bank, so that if that unit in particular can be breached, then sensitive financial information for the countries that belong to the institution can fall into the hands of the wrong people.
And whose hands might they fall into, and what could they do with that information?
Well, there would be information there probably about countries that are about to get loans, how much the loans would be, what they would be for, currency reserves, hard currency reserves in different countries, what the value of currency is projected to be on international currency markets, and so on. Information that governments hold very closely and do not want to be public.
But shouldn't this be information that, as Neil was saying, should be transparent and open to the public, everybody?
Well, there are limits, I think, about what should be public in terms of financial information having to do with a country's internal economic situation, and that governments guard very closely what they want to release and not release and when they release it, because of problems of financial panic and as a result of policies that the World Bank itself has promoted over the years. The lifting of capital controls, for example, if it became public that reserves in a country like Brazil were lower than many international investors believed, suddenly you might have a flood of hot money out of Brazil that was not foreseen by the government and was really not necessary to protect anybody's investments.
Now, the IT system at the bank had been run by a company that recently admitted that it has been engaging in massive fraud. What kind of due diligence did the bank do in letting the contract to this company?
This arrangement goes beyond the question of due diligence, really, where the bank, what we know now is that high levels of bank management knew as long ago as 3 years ago that at the highest levels of this company, Satyam Computer Services, there was a problem of corruption. And not only did the bank not take direct action at the time they knew there was a problem, but it appears that they have been active in concealing that problem from the public.
You work with whistleblowers at the bank on a regular basis. What kind of internal internal due process system exists at the bank to hear disclosures from staff who know of problems of corruption and misdoing?
There's a basic problem for whistleblowers in the bank, and that is that there's no independent judiciary in a real practical sense, so that anyone inside the bank who believes that there's a problem of misconduct or corruption or fraud, when that person goes to what they believe is a neutral office to report the problem, they are in danger of reporting to an office that is not independent enough to take action either to address the wrongdoing or to protect the whistleblower.
So what should be done?
There needs to be a more independent system of internal judicial processes. And all of the intergovernmental organizations, this isn't just a problem at the World Bank, it's all of the international development banks and the UN system need to have a more independent judiciary. And the bank is now working on making arrangements for a more independent conflict resolution system, but they have been very reluctant to allow any kind of external oversight of whistleblower protection policy, for example, or grievance procedures in general for the staff.
And in the absence of that, is it possible for a whistleblower to avail him or herself of national judicial systems?
No, it isn't, because the bank enjoys sovereign immunity. Anything that is done as a part of bank staff members' job duties, either because they're working on a project or a loan or as part of the bank as an institution, is protected from any kind of lawsuit and even criminal prosecution by the bank's own legal immunities. And those immunities are virtually impenetrable unless the bank waives them voluntarily.
Well, many thanks to Neil Watkins of Jubilee USA and Bea Edwards of the Government Accountability Project for your insights into the problems at the bank and possible solutions. When we return, what can a Treasury lawyer who blew the whistle on the 1980 Chrysler bailout tell us about today's massive bailouts about Detroit, and much bigger yet, Wall Street? Welcome back to Whistle Where You Work. I'm Mark Cohen. It's like deja vu all over again for Elaine Mittleman. In the 1970s, Mittleman parlayed an MBA from Carnegie Mellon University into a prestigious financial analyst position at Ford Motor Company in Detroit. Then, upon earning a law degree from the University of Michigan, was quickly recruited to the US Treasury Department in Washington in 1980 to work on the $1.5 billion Chrysler bailout. As we'll hear, she was apparently a bit too conscientious in performing her job. Welcome, Elaine Mittleman, to Whistle Where You Work. So you arrive in Washington, it's May 1980, and you go to work, and almost from the very first day you begin to smell something funny going on.
Correct. The first time I looked at what the projections were for the industry volume sales, I could tell they were what we called at the time rosy scenario, way overly optimistic.
How could you tell that?
Because of my experience in the auto industry, I had previously had that assignment at Ford to work on forecasting industry volume, and I could tell the numbers it made no sense at all.
So you told this to your bosses at Treasury, and were they receptive to the information?
They told me that wasn't my assignment and I shouldn't do that.
Okay, so fast forward a little bit to September of 1980. You're at the Shoreham Hotel in Washington, D.C. You're in the circular driveway, the semicircular driveway, right, and you encounter Lee Iacocca, the CEO of Chrysler. Tell me about that encounter.
Yes, I saw Lee Iacocca, and I went up to him and I said that I was working at the Treasury on the Chrysler bailout, and I used to work at Ford on finance staff. And he said to me, "Who was your boss at finance staff, and what department were you in?" And I told him, and he then used a bad word and said, "You understand what we're doing?" And I said, "Oh, I understand perfectly well."
And so was that the end of it, or was there some follow-up from Iacocca?
After that, one of the officials at Chrysler was in charge of sending in the financial reports, started spending a lot of time trying to talk me out of sending in the reports, and I'm sure that that came from Iacocca. He would say to me, "Elaine, just sit there at your desk and look pretty, and we don't want to send those reports in," and it just escalated from there.
Tell us about what is significant about these reports.
Well, after Chrysler got their funds, we were supposed to monitor their financial situation, and there was an operating plan and a financing plan which they were supposed to be in compliance with, and there were monthly certificates supposed to be signed by Iacocca. And they were not in compliance, and Iacocca did not sign the certificate, so they obviously didn't send them in, and that was what was significant.
And did you ask them to send them in?
Yes, and the same person, Fred Zuckerman, and he, for example, would say...
This Fred Zuckerman of Chrysler Corporation.
From Chrysler, and he would say to me, for example, "Well, we mailed them, didn't you get them?" I said, "No, I didn't get them." And finally he told me, when I forced the issue about the reports, that I was going to cause Chrysler to go bankrupt. He got extremely angry with me.
Today we have something called TARP, the Trouble Assets Relief Program. Mm-hmm. Back then there was something called the Chrysler Loan Guarantee Board, which was set up to provide oversight and the use of the Chrysler bailout monies. Fed chairman of the time, Paul Volcker, was on that board. He was curious as to how Chrysler was going to succeed with this program as well, wasn't he? And there was a hearing about it. Tell us about that.
Yes, under the loan guarantee, Chrysler had to come in to ask for additional drawdowns of funds, and in December 1980 they came in for the third drawdown. It was very controversial. And at the meeting with Iacocca and the Chrysler Loan Guarantee Board, I was there, and Paul Volcker asked questions of the consultants, which there were several outside consultants, about the financing plan and the marketing forecast, things like that. It was clear that the numbers really were ludicrous, did not add up at all. And so Paul Volcker said, "Well, I'm going to have to vote yes," meaning to give Chrysler more money, but not based on the numbers, because he could tell the numbers were they just didn't make any sense.
So when he said, "I'm going to have to vote yes," what did you interpret that to mean?
That it was a political situation, and that there was really no viable way for them to vote no. So the whole concept of oversight, I think, was just for show, essentially.
So who was monitoring the Chrysler bailout?
No one. In fact, when Chrysler got their third drawdown, at that time, the audit report was a qualified opinion, because the auditors could not say that Chrysler was a going concern. So it was nowhere near what you would have auditing oversight if you went to get a loan from a bank.
So going back to this question of the certificates,
right,
for a second, did you tell your bosses about this?
They told me to just sit at my desk and be quiet, and they said that the mere sound of my voice made the Chrysler executives shake in their shoes, and that I was not to speak to any more Chrysler executives. And
did they indicate that they were doing something about the absence of these certificates?
No, they did that. After I was fired, when the Chrysler got the money at the third drawdown, they had to retroactively waive all those requirements, so they never were met.
Okay, well, you mentioned you got fired. We're going to get to that in a minute. During this time, were you sharing the fact that you weren't getting these certificates with anybody outside of the Treasury Department?
I started going over to Capitol Hill probably in the summer when I first became concerned, and I met repeatedly with numerous people on the Hill, yes.
And what would you tell them?
told them we weren't getting the documents that we needed, and they were very concerned. Most of them were very concerned.
And did they take action at that point?
Again, after I got fired, Congressman Henry Royce wrote a letter to the head of the General Accounting Office, who was also on the board, expressing his concern about the lack of oversight and the reporting requirements, specifically referring to my efforts. Mm-hmm. So they tried to, but again, it was a political decision, and there was no way they were going to vote no. And Congressman Royce was also concerned that one of the voting members was the Comptroller General, which is supposed to be doing the oversight to help Congress. So he was essentially wearing a dual hat, and he said, Congressman Royce said that should never happen again, and I don't think it has.
Within the Treasury Department, did you take this information to the Inspector General?
Yes, I did. I went to the Inspector General, and at that time, the Inspector General was also kind of it was not a statutory Inspector General, and they did an investigation. Which, when
you say not a statutory Inspector General, that is, the Inspector General was selected by the Treasury Secretary, and by the administration, there wasn't any independence.
Correct. It was not independent Inspector General, and so the report was politicized. It primarily investigated me, even though I'm the one that went to the Inspector General. Although it did say that the reporting, Chrysler had been less than thorough in its reporting requirements. So there were subsequent articles in the Wall Street Journal, for example, about the Inspector General report.
Mm-hmm. And what did he find about you?
It's a little bit complicated, but in my efforts to talk to my superiors, including Roger Altman, who was the Assistant Secretary, Roger Altman and others said that I had been caught in his office looking for cover-up documents. And so the Treasury Inspector General investigated that supposed incident, which never happened. And that would have not been their purview anyway.
And what was the consequence of that?
Well, that supposed incident, and they thought I was stealing documents, all kinds of other crazy accusations. As I said, I got fired, and they literally said I was a security risk. I mean, it was a very upsetting and debilitating time for me, and to the point where they said I was not allowed in the Treasury building.
And when did this occur?
That occurred after I went to the meeting when Iacocca came in to ask for more money, and they said they did not want me anywhere near the meeting or anything else because I'm sure I would be rocking the boat. And Altman said I presented a list for potential risk for damaging news leaks. They said I was leaking to the New York Times, which I was not doing, but they just accused me of that.
Mm-hmm. But there were articles in the New York Times, weren't there? There
was an article in the New York Times after I was fired. I did not leak to the New York Times. Mm-hmm. I'm not against leaking, but I did not leak. And there was no leak to the New York Times.
Okay. And how did your firing at the Treasury Department affect your career subsequently?
Obviously, very dramatically. As an attorney, when you go to interview, they say, well, what was your last job? And if you say you got fired from the Treasury Department, that clearly doesn't make for a very good interview. So I essentially have been on my own ever since. I'm mm-hmm. practicing solo practitioner.
Did you seek any other government jobs after that?
Yes, I did. I had actually been offered a job at the Commerce Department several years later on international trade, and which required a security clearance. And so when the security clearance investigation occurred, many of these accusations from the Treasury were brought up again, and I did not get that job.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit in the few minutes we have remaining about the relevance of the Chrysler bailout of 1980 to today in terms of the conflict of interests, that rules that were applicable then and today, and also the role of the Inspector General.
Okay. I think it's highly relevant today, and I think I'm very sad the way the auto industry is today, and I wish it were doing better than it is, so it's not that I'm wishing it ill, I'm not. And that bailout, and I think the bailouts today, the people that are going to benefit are the consultants, the attorneys, except for someone like me, the bankers probably, and not the worker. And so when people say the Chrysler bailout worked, it did not save the workers' jobs. It saved, made a hero out of Iacocca, for example. Roger Altman, who fired me, went on to become a big-time investment banker, so he could brag that he worked on the Chrysler bailout. And I think that's the same thing that's going to happen today. The people that will benefit will be the people, that can parlay it into another job or cut themselves a special deal, something like that.
Well, I noticed that their trade analysts are saying that Chrysler, even with the bailout money from this year, isn't going to make it as an independent company, and by the end of the year there will be a big two automakers in the U.S. But the conventional wisdom is that the Chrysler bailout of 1980 was a success. It saved thousands of jobs and it saved Chrysler. Isn't that true?
I don't know how many jobs it saved. Many people lost their jobs at that time, and I think you could argue, looking in hindsight now, that possibly if Chrysler had gone through bankruptcy then and a more rigorous restructuring, that it might have benefited all of the big three, because the auto industry is a cyclical industry, and Chrysler was always the weakest link of the three. And I think the Chrysler bailout may have actually hurt GM and Ford, even to this day. So, as I said, I'm very sad for the situation, but I think that was a temporary fix, and we're back in a very much deeper situation now that the Chrysler bailout from 1980 just really fed into, I think.
And finally, knowing now what you know about what happened to your career, if you had it to do it again, would you have blown the whistle?
I mean, I did what I thought was ethically right. I had no idea that they would go to such extremes to damage my reputation. But I think I've learned a lot about whistleblowers. I think that happens a lot. And I think people need to realize that there needs to be a lot more backup and protection for whistleblowers. There is no protection for whistleblowers. People say there is. That's not true. But yes, I would do it again because I, ethically did what I felt I had to do.
Well, history seems to be repeating itself, only this time the sticker price is exponentially greater. Hopefully, Elaine Mittleman's experience in 1980 will not fall on deaf ears in 2009. Thanks, Elaine, for your courage in speaking out and for joining us on Whistle Where You Work. I'm Mark Cohen.